Planning Committee, and there was a presentation on some of our issues, which are still issues with water and the environment, and the speaker backed out on Southwest Jewish Congress with fairly short notice, and Jane knew that I had been involved in the Environmental Commission and said, well, maybe Barry knows somebody, and I had a speaker, and the next thing I knew, I was on the planning committee. And my background is I'm a pediatrician, one of my long-standing and political activists, and one of my long-term interests has been in asthma, and I got involved through Dallas Area Interfaith in looking at air quality and its relationship. And my first work was indoor air quality, but then Kara Mendelson, who represents District 12, appointed me to the Environmental Commission, and I had to learn a whole new area and field. And some of you who are here with me tonight have been people who helped me learn, and I appreciate you. So we decided to put, because air quality is an issue in Dallas, we're non-compliant at this point, although working on it. The city, in my view, has taken a very constructive viewpoint and has a really cool plan. And along the way, there were several people that I met, and they're going to be the major presenters. Hopefully I'll just ask a few questions because they all know a lot more than I do. So on my far right over there is Dr. David Lary. Dr. Lary will introduce himself when we get finished. To his left is Dr. Afolabi, who is a pediatric pulmonologist at UT Southwestern, and like myself, very interested in asthma and air quality issues. And we both serve on the health committee for the Dallas Environmental Commission. And then finally, Susan Alvarez, who is with the North Texas Council of Governments, and before that with the city of Dallas. And we first met each other a number of years ago when I was working with Dallas Area Interfaith on changes to the housing code, and then we reunited when she was with the Environmental Commission, and Councilperson Mendelson appointed me, and now she's with North Texas Council of Governments as the Director for Development and the Environment. Anyway, let each of the people introduce themselves a little bit and sort of what their interests are. Also, why don't you go ahead, each of you. Just say.
So it's really nice to meet you. My name's David. I am a professor at UT Dallas, and my passion is sensing to serve society. So we use 9 sentinel types to do that. You see some of them up there, from wearables at one extreme to the other, satellites, robot teams, sensors across cities, and the idea of all of it is for actionable insights.
And Dr. Lary will be, as you can see, giving us a little bit of a presentation on his work, and we'll see where that fits into public health. Dr. Afolabi.
So my name is Sade Afolabi. I'm a pediatric pulmonologist at UT Southwestern. I've been there since 2016. I have a passion for kids with asthma. I have a passion for kids with lung disease. And I got really interested in the environment really only 5 years ago or so. Is where I really started to get that big passion for the environment and the needs of especially children in the Dallas area. And seeing how air quality significantly impacts their ability to go to school, learn, function, and play. And I felt like there was something that I could do on a larger level, and had the opportunity to join the Environmental Health Committee. And I've been as active as I can in the community since then.
Okay, so for those of you a certain age that remember Monty Python's Flying Circus, and now there's something completely different. I am not a doctor, PhD or otherwise. My background actually is in watershed management and restoration. did that for a lot of years. Did some air quality, but it was mostly related to addressing National Environmental Protection Act requirements. So if a roadway was going in, what is that gonna do to the community? Probably about 10 years ago, I got a great offer because of my background in watershed restoration. I was asked to lead an effort by the city of Dallas to do the climate plan, which is great. Our biggest risk here, besides air quality and heat, is crazy thunderstorms and too much rain coupled with too little rain. And so my background was perfect for that challenge. My sister very cheerfully told me that I better get my resume in order. There was no way that Dallas would ever do a climate plan. And I love a good challenge. And so in 2020, we unanimously adopted a climate plan. Along that route, I'm a good civil engineer. I don't do anything outside the building line. So I got into this world where a majority of our impacts were coming from buildings and energy and transportation. I outlawed transportation, but I had to learn a whole bunch. And along the way, I also had the opportunity to learn a whole bunch about air quality, because that is one of the challenges here. One of the other things is that the Dallas efforts around climate, like many other cities, rightly focuses on environmental justice and on implementing with an eye for equity. In other words, one size doesn't fit all. We don't put trees, North Dallas and South Dallas, the same number. We put trees where we need to put trees. And it might be 400 here, and it might be 2 here, or none. So that was kind of a different way of looking at things. I'm very proud of the plan we did, because the U.S. Green Building Council called us out for being the first plan to effectively address equity in all 97 actions. So that plan is literally everything A to Z, air quality to zero waste, with buildings and transportation and water and food and all kinds of things in between. It is both science-based and community-based. Everything in that plan is vetted through science and modeling, but the idea came from the community. So I did that. We had a great committee with council that helped get that approved. We had a very robust stakeholder process, and out of that grew the desire to have ongoing input. We don't want just another pretty plan that sits on the shelf. We want you to be doing stuff. So we formed an environmental commission, and that's how I met these lovely people. One of the other projects we did actually was with the Nature Conservancy. And they had a project called Breathe Easy Dallas that was one of the first projects that we had done that was exploring air quality versus absenteeism versus transportation, and what happens if we pull in some trees? And so we worked with the Nature Conservancy, Texas A&M, and Texas Trees Foundation, and did that first study. We selected 12 locations for air quality monitors that we calibrated very carefully against the state monitors, so that we knew the data we had was data, and that it reflected reality. And it was really interesting. Some of the monitors worked really well for some annelids, some not so much. From that, we applied for and got 2 subsequent grants from EPA for environmental justice. And I've been able to deploy additional monitors. One of the things that we did was we looked at absenteeism, and we correlated that with sanitized public health data. And I say sanitized because it was pulled into an anonymous group, so that we wouldn't have individual cases, so that it was anonymized, I guess. We have some schools that have absentee rates of over 38%. if a kid is not in school that much, they're really gonna struggle. And so that's really where this came from, is how do we get the air quality good enough so that those kids are healthy? And so one thing led to another. Really good questions about, is it internal, is it external, are there other issues at play? We still don't know. And we don't want to study it to death, but we have gotten additional funding to look at additional things. We have found that using vegetative screens, trees, both help cool those transportation corridors and also help filter particularly some of the particulates. One thing led to another. And I was like, I need a bigger sandbox to play with. So I went over to the North Central Texas Council of Governments, which coordinates transportation, and through that, something called a state implementation plan, which is basically a regional air quality plan for all intents and purposes. Our area is in severe non-attainment for air quality. What that means is if we are not able to get into attainment by 2026, so not very far away in city terms, they will cheerfully start assessing fines. And we're like, okay, cool, how much are those fines? Well, it's 45 to 48 million a year.
Okay.
Whoa.
That's enough to get people's attention.
Good.
And so we're working with the state. We just did a grant to the EPA for 199 million, of which 122 is transportation. That's where we did a really interesting comparison of what they call priority pollutants, which is air quality pollutants, versus greenhouse gas sources, which is what we look at for climate planning. And guess what? The problem children were one and the same. It was transportation and buildings and energy. That's actually probably good news. I spoke to some engineers yesterday. I'm like, that's good news. That's the built environment. We can fix that. It's gonna be cheap, it's gonna be easy, but it is something we can and should do. So with that, I'll shut up.
Well, we'll be hearing more later. The next thing I wanted to do, since it's a fairly small audience, is I'd like you each to go around and each of you introduce yourself in one sentence what brought you here. Susan?
Oh, I'm Susan Myers, and I'm with Southwest Jewish Congress.
Pearl Garza-Fracke, I'm on the board.
Cicely, that way. Rosie Stromberg, and what brings me here is that I have a family history of people chasing down corporate bodies who pollute the air. And so I feel as if I'm a secondary advocate for breathers.
Okay, I'm Jane Lachman. I'm here because Larry's here. And I'm on the Planning Commission, Southwest Jewish Congress.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Poston. I'm a Texas Master Naturalist and member of the Environmental Commission's Strategic Partnerships and Innovation Subcommittee, and I'm here because I'm always looking to learn more, and I know I can always learn more from these guys.
I'm Madan Goel, and resident of Dallas area for 40 years, and I'm just interested.
Nelda?
I'm Nelda Golden. I'm in charge of the program committee. I have been with Southwest Jewish Congress for years, forever. And it's a great group, and we've done some nice things, and we intend to keep going and programming and try to satisfy the needs and explore various things that we've been doing for some time. It's a pleasure having you.
I'm Jonathan Spiegel. I'm an immediate past chair of the Southwest Jewish Congress, and I'm here because I'm interested in the topic and interested in learning more, and I appreciate y'all coming together and educating us.
I'm Glenda Jackson. I'm also on the board of the Southwest Jewish Congress. I'm interested in hearing what you all would tell us we should each be doing as individuals to improve air quality.
I'm Helen Roth, and I just want to know what we can do to make this world a better place.
I'm Ann Ramsey Gardner. I founded a nonprofit called Kim Clarity, which hopes to reduce chemical-related illnesses, and chemicals are largely part of indoor air quality. At least that's the aspect I'm trying to address. So I'm very interested in this topic.
Francine Lee. Professionally, I'm a paralegal. I work for a judge in Dallas County. Hobby-wise, I'm with Don. Surprised to see you here. I serve with him on the DART CAC, so glad that you are here. And I got a son who has asthma, so air quality, I'm always very concerned. And now that I got a panel here, I'm like, hey. So.
I'm Harvey Wine, retired. I live in a high-rise condominium that has approximately 640 people, and I'm interested in finding out about air quality concerning older buildings and recirculation on a system that is universal for our building. And the building was built in the 80s.
Peter. My name is Peter Johnson, and I'm here because I had a friend cross the bridge in Selma with me. And he's sitting right up there with white hair.
Oh my God.
Deeply concerned about the air we breathe, we must address this.
Hello, my name is Benji Popoch. I'm a second-year medical student at UT Southwestern. I had the fortune of meeting Dr. Lachman the other day, and he invited me to come out. Any opportunity to learn about the health of our community is one I'm happy to take, so glad to be here.
Hi, my name is Tamika DeRoe. I'm a resident of the Joplin community. I'm also the City of Dallas Environmental Commissioner for District 7, and I'm here because I live in a community who faces air quality issues, and also I'm here because my team is here. Dr. Abagati and Dr. Lachman, we serve together on the Environmental Commission.
And Rebecca, of course, then outside. You're in force.
And I'm Susie Avenary, and I'm the president of Southwest Jewish Congress, so I'm here to hear the program. I grew up with asthma, so always interested to know something about air quality. Thank you all for coming and presenting.
So what we're going to do next is that we're going to hear a little bit more from each of our panelists. Why, you've heard a lot about asthma. What the question is how do we measure air quality? For that, Dr. Lary really is our expert. What are some of the health consequences that arise from the issues we're seeing with air quality? And there, Dr. Afolabi, and maybe some comments from me. And then finally, and I think that Ms. Alvarez has really touched on that. What has governments do and what more kind of needs to be done? So with that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Lary, and he's going to talk to us for some minutes about how we measure air quality, what some of the challenges are.
Thank you. It's really nice to see you all, and I'm relying on Barry to shut me up when my time is up. Okay, so air quality is something that impacts all of us, but unlike many things that we see with our eyes, we don't see it. So really, it's like an unseen herd of elephants romping around our room. And so we probably, as a society, first realized some of that with COVID. I mean, we suddenly became aware of these things called aerosols that were really tiny, that we can't see, and they had a big impact on us. So air quality actually spans a very large number of chemicals, literally thousands of them, and about 6 of them are regulated as criterion pollutants. And so I'm not going to pretend to do all of that, but rather I'm going to take an exemplar of airborne particles to let us look at some of the issues. So the very practical motivation, so my lab in the university is called MINTS AI, and the AI bit is for actionable insights, but it's also a play on words because we heavily use machine learning in all of this. So essentially we use 9 different sentinel types to measure air quality on multiple scales. So you may say, well, why on earth do we need to do that? Well, from our everyday experience, you can imagine if you walk by a fire or a smokestack of some kind, there can be a very local plume that impacts us. But if you go a block away, if it's just a little fire, you're not going to notice it. But on the other hand, we may be impacted by some massive event, like you see in this animation here. So this is, we're estimating from space the airborne particulates, and this particular event, as this example was from 2010, in September and October, this is a California fire. So the colors correspond to how much in micrograms per cubic meter. So the scale here goes up to 25. So the EPA standard averaged over a year for PM25, 2.5, used to be 12, and it's been brought down to 9 now. So you can see this red area is a really large amount of these particles, and it's not just local, it's spreading across the country. So likewise, we have Saharan dust plumes. That would be another example of long-range transport. Right now, there's one in Europe. And so there's a place in Chad where 100 days of every year there's a dust storm. And that dust can go all the way across the ocean in about 9 days. And so 90% of the mineral dust reaching the Amazon rainforest comes from that one location. So the simple point I'm trying to make to you is really the pollution is all about sources and how close we are to the sources. Because pretty much everything that goes into the atmosphere, 3 things can happen to it. We either release it, we emit it from cars or fires or whatnot. It can get washed out, or it can react. So these get blown about, react, or washed out. So they're basically the 3 things. So how close we are to sources makes a really big difference. And to illustrate how that can be a hyperlocal thing, this was actually an education for me. I didn't realize it. So about, let's say, 15 years ago, when instead of looking at the satellite base, because I used to work at NASA, but I was more interested in the very local microscale as well, where we live and breathe. So the first time I put one of these particulate sensors on my kitchen counter, and I left it overnight, and in the morning I walked by it, and suddenly the readings, like, whoa, they were really changing. And so when we look across this room, it looks pretty uniform to us, right? We don't really see anything in the air. But even in this room, we have hyperlocal changes, microenvironments. And so we also set out to see our body's response to this. So we've all heard of the poor canary down a coal mine. The unenviable job is to be the miner's sentinel. So when the canary conks out, the miner knows, uh-oh, it's time to go, right?
So you sent grad students down the line?
No, I try to be a humane. Actually, I was the canary in this thing. So I was going to conk out first. So my mantra is, no canary has to die. So the simple idea was, we're all familiar, we look up at a light, our pupils shut down in a few milliseconds, and we can actually measure that. We have done as part of this army project. You can see he's wearing eye tracking glasses, and actually I'm the cyclist here and I'm wearing them there. So just like our eyes in a few milliseconds responds to the light environment, we actually also, it turns out, respond to what we're inhaling, down to really low concentrations. So from measuring our body's autonomic response, things like changing in our heart rate, our skin temperature, the voltages across our head with these EEGs that we're measuring here, or our pupil diameter, we can really accurately infer the concentration of multiple things we're inhaling, from how many particles of a given size, right down to the COVID size, in fact, in micrograms per cubic meter. We can be really accurate, to the concentration of CO2 we're inhaling, or a whole range of different gases. So it turns out we're a phenomenal sensing system. And we're not normally used to decoding our autonomic response, but if we're to do so, we can actually accurately infer the concentration of gases. So right now I'm wearing a ring. This is an aura ring. There's 7 temperature measurements in there. There's my heart rate variability, and blood oxygen. So from actually just those parameters, we could really quite accurately infer the concentration of multiple components of the air we're breathing. So what's really remarkable, if you then look at the spatial variation, so the sensors that we're deploying across cities, and I'll show you in a moment what Susan mentioned, it's really important to calibrate them. So in Fort Worth, we've co-located our lower cost sensors next to a regulatory grade one, and they really compare very well. But there's like a factor of 100 different in the cost or more. So instead of $100,000, maybe $1 million, depending what you spec for those sensors, ours are of the orders of hundreds or a few $1,000s. So the cheaper the price is, the more locations you can locate these. And then if you see an issue, you can always dispatch, if you like, a reference sensor to go and check out, the final details. So these 3 students, they were involved in fabricating, designing, building every aspect of these sensors. So they were each wearing them. These measure the airborne particles from the COVID size up to 10 microns in 7 size bands. So this is a map here of the UTD campus, and they walked around the campus every second measuring the airborne particles that can be triggers for the asthma, like we heard. And there's a GPS in there, so it geolocates and timestamps them. And the colors again correspond to the concentrations. So this location here, where you see the red, that is a main exit route for the university. So at the time they were walking around, the 3 of them in different places, there were lots of cars going out of there. So you probably see, to Susan's point, the single highest location is where there were lots of cars moving slowly. So the maximum emissions from cars come when we're at a standstill, either the lights change green or it's our turn to move, we put our foot on the gas if we have a gas car, and that's the maximum emissions. All right? So here you see they're pretty high levels, but then other places just around the corner, they're much lower, sometimes orders of magnitude lower. So supposing now we're at a high school and there's lots of kids in the class that have asthma. So if the coach knows right where the coach is, what the current pollution levels are, maybe practice could be inside instead of outside, because inside we have some chance of doing something about the levels of the particulates. And just over here, the concentration spiked to 680 micrograms per cubic meter, and that's when one of the students walked past somebody vaping. Right?
Yes.
So maybe it's not such a good idea. Now, we also are measuring at multiple.
To interrupt, the Environmental Commission, the Health Committee, has proposed that we follow the other large Texas cities and add vaping to the smoking ordinance. We are very hopeful that City Council will look at that favorably.
Well, just as a factoid, we actually built a system for a school where vaping was a real issue. We put it in the vents, a fake vent in the bathrooms. So from the size distribution of the aerosols, we could actually check which type of vape they were using, because they have very different signatures. And the very first person they caught was a teacher. So. Okay. So, the simple point I wanted you to take away from this is there's hyperlocal variability spatially and temporally. So right now, for the number of EPA sensors that the TCEQ administer across the Metroplex, they're very useful because they're accurate, they're regulatory grade. But really, we did a detailed analysis where we would drive around, for example, a 10 by 10 kilometer square, which corresponded to one of our satellite pixels, every day for several months, measuring every second as we drove the full size distribution of the airborne particles. And we found that to be characterizing that neighborhood scale air quality, which would then be impacting, for example, the asthma, but a whole range of other things, we really need to be measuring every half a kilometer. So if all we have are the regulatory grade instruments, while they're wonderful, they're the best at it, we can't afford that. So that's why we've been trying to augment it with these 3 other types of approaches. From satellite, from lower cost sensors, and here you see 2 incarnations, one on the building, the other wearables, and thirdly from the wearables, which are remarkably accurate. So that's what we've been trying to do, and I think I need to speed it up a bit. So this is a picture of an actual sneeze that was taken by MIT during COVID. And so what is kind of an interesting factoid is, why do we have this 6 feet social distancing? Because actually it's very much related to the particulate measurements that we're talking about for health reasons. Well, it so happens that as you and I are just talking normally, we're actually releasing airborne particles, and they go about 6 foot. All right? So the purpose of the masks are both to stop our particles going to somebody else, but also to stop theirs coming to us. But if you or I were to sneeze, those particles go easily 27 feet, going faster than a baseball. So they will be on the other side of the room before you can say Jiminy Cricket. Right? And many of these are really small. So the second thing I want you to remember is,
the size of a human hair, isn't it?
So a human hair is about 70 microns across, all right, 70 micrometers, and the COVID size is 0.1 of a micrometer, so 700 times smaller. Right? So the smaller the particles get, the deeper they can go into our lungs. And it's not just asthma. So, for example, when I worked at NASA, I partnered with the nursing school in the University of Maryland, and I looked at all emergency room admissions for an entire year, all ICD codes. And I found way more compact relationship than with asthma, although there was one with asthma, was actually unspecified schizophrenia. So that was tracking the concentration of airborne particles much more coherently than asthma. Now, there's recently been this large increase in things like Alzheimer's. And it turns out that there may be an association to the particulates. Because what happens, it seems, is that the small particles, they're so small, they get deep into our lungs, and they're small enough that they can get across into our bloodstream, then from the bloodstream into the brain. When they get into the brain, which can happen quite quickly, they seem to cause inflammation. So I have another appointment at the Brain Health Center at UT Dallas, and they have really good images. They have 2 fMRI images. And one of the professors there, Bart Rimper, who's over that facility, he's actually been measuring the inflammation in the brain. And so on that bike you saw that's riding around, we were measuring the surface voltages across the head, but we could also, with another instrument called an FNIRS, use infrared radiation to see actually the blood flow and the blood dynamics in the surface brain. And that blood is carrying oxygen. So if what's in the air is affecting the oxygen carrying capacity or the levels of blood oxygen, that can have a knock-on effect for so many things. So that's another area we're really excited about. So the final point I wanted to tell you from this, That's the main reason why we're measuring these ultrafine particles. So right now they're not criterion pollutants, but the smaller you go, like if you take the 2.5 micron particles, in every volume element of the air, there's about 1,000 of them. So we measure that every second at all of our locations. But when you get down to the 0.1 micron, there's about 1 million of them. So there's 3 orders of magnitude more, but they're much smaller, so there's much less mass with them, but there's way more of them, and they get deeper. So this is all about actionable insights, because we're never going to be able to see those. They're so tiny, but we can accurately sense them. Okay, so think of them as a Trojan horse, all right? They may be very small, but because they're very small, they can get across after we've inhaled them to our bloodstream and then maybe get deposited elsewhere in our body. So I'm running out of time, so this is just a size chart of different sizes and the types of things that are those, but I need to move on. So I've told us about this, I'm running out of time. Well, maybe this is interesting for you. So this is the kit where we are measuring our body's autonomic response. So you see across the brain we're measuring 64 different voltages. There's the eye tracking glasses and so on. So that's what I was wearing while I was riding. And then this electric car was measuring the composition of the air, because all that stuff was too heavy to carry on the bike. I actually tried a subset of it and I fell off. So anyway, so we found a remarkable agreement between these. Oh, and I don't know if any of you know Breckenridge Park. There is a mile-long circuit in there that's used a lot for cyclists. And over just this really small location, again, the colors reflect the concentrations, you get really different levels. So, for example, it's not just the particulates. We also did this for gases like CO2 you were mentioning earlier. And over a relatively short period, these concentrations vary by 3 orders of magnitude. So you can have these hyperlocal variations. So it's great we have the regulatory grade sensors across DFW, but if you are much more than about half a kilometer away from that, it's great for over there, but it probably doesn't bear too much resemblance for where we happen to be. So, yes. So I got carried away with the earlier bit. So this is what I wanted to show you. This axis was the measured reference values from the particulate monitor for particles 1 micron in diameter in micrograms per cubic meter. And this axis was the estimated values just from the wearables. And you see, this is a straight line. And this was over multiple collections, and it turned out if we had multiple participants, they would also still fall on the same line. So this time series you see here, each colored region is a different collection. That's a different loop around that circuit where you saw the bike going. And the black line is the actual concentration of these particles. The red dashed line is estimated solely from the wearable sensors. So our autonomic system is responding on the millisecond time scale, and from that we can get really accurate, not just concentrations of particles, but multiple gases. So now,
is that an algorithm where you put all the data together that you're sensing to get to this?
yes, so we collected 600 parameters, 500 times a second, and with the derived ones, actually, we had 17,000 parameters and multiple pollutants. And so we did that because it's like everything in the kitchen sink. We didn't know what was going to be important. But then of those, like the skin temperature, heart rate variability, blood oxygen, and sweat response were big ones.
Could you say what a kilometer is like in city blocks?
Yes, it's like 2/3 of a mile. I'm sorry, I'm using kilometers because of this metric system of science here.
How does Dallas in North Texas compare to other parts of the country?
Okay, so let me jump ahead. Can I come back to that in a moment, because I'll lose my thread. I will try and answer that for you. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to mention is we're not just looking at multiple spatial scales, we have multiple time scales involved. So we have the millisecond to second time scale of that autonomic response, just like you look up at a light, your pupils shut down, it's very rapid. So we have that response to air quality. But you imagine now we have a repeated insult. Supposing you're downwind of some polluting factory or some source of smoke, whatever it is. One day it has an issue. If it doesn't persist, we'll probably get over it. But if it's every day, persistently, then we have a cascade of processes. So there's the autonomic response, seconds, milliseconds, hormonal and endocrine response, like minutes, hours, maybe days. But then if it still persists, we have a more chronic response, and then that can be like emergency room admissions, because this has persisted over time. So what my dream is, we never have to get there, all right? So it's not just the canary that doesn't have to die. If we can deal with these sources, that's really a good thing. So let me tell you another little story. With the Environmental Defense Fund, we measured across the Barnett Shale, actually methane gas. So the Barnett Shale is a really large place, and as you go across it, actually the composition of the gas changes. But if you take all the gas leaks, or all the emissions, let's call it like that, from the entire Barnett Shale, 99% of them come from about 1% of the sources. So, if we can find those 1% of the sources and do something about it, everybody wins. Like you might have heard, there's this place called Dish, Texas, named after the Dish Network, where they had flammable drinking water. So literally, you open your faucet and you can light it. That's because the methane was leaking into the water. So obviously undesirable, we don't want things blowing up. So it's in everybody's interest to find them. So in similar manner, from every one of our sensors, which make a measurement every second, we use the meteorology to see where did that air come from. Now, if we just do one trajectory for 1 second, there's a large uncertainty. But if we're doing that every second of every day, thank you, for thousands of these locations, it suddenly becomes very robust. So what you find is there's certain synoptic weather regimes so that you can start to allocate 15% of the time at this location, the air is coming from this location. The rest of the time is coming from these other ones. So that can help us to then identify the big sources so we have a chance of doing something to avoid the $46 million things or the emergency room admissions or whatever. And it's everyone's interest. Like, you know, I don't think anyone's going to lose from that. So really what we're measuring is this thing called the exposome. That's a measure of our total exposure over our lifetime, from within our mum's wombs to whatever age we are. So we actually, at each of our locations, now, remember we've co-located these with regulatory grade ones and they've compared very well. So as well as measuring every second, like the size distribution of particles, CO2, the meteorology, the wind speed and direction, we also listen to birdsong. So this is a measure of biodiversity. So just as human health is impacted by pollutants, so is bird health. So, and actually sometimes the birds have a party. So when we had the really hot weather, it sort of quite abruptly ended this year. Like in one day, it went from pretty warm, it suddenly dropped. That next day, they were really tweety. I mean, they went from about, at some of our sites, from a total number of 100 to 300 calls of a given species per day to like 1,400 of several thousand. It's like they were really having a party. It was kind of wonderful. Okay, so this is an example of how you actually see the air quality change before your eyes. So this is our model aircraft as part of one of our NASA projects for satellite validation. So this is a remote control aerial vehicle carrying aerosol size spectrometer. And it's the same airport on 2 different days. This blue sky day is a low pollution day. This grey day is a high pollution day, because all these little aerosols, they scatter light, and that's why it looks grey. And also here you can see an example of the abrupt changes from a couple of weeks ago. So this jiggling is every second. So instead of recording every hour, we do it every second, so we can actually characterize the representativeness. So how representative is an individual observation of what you see over some spatial temporal window? So to your question, how does Dallas compare? So you saw at the beginning where we had that plume from the California fires. So we did that whole process for every day of an entire year. And what these 2 different color plots show is for the entire United States, for the state of Texas, and for Dallas County. And what you're seeing is the percentage of the time that the PM levels were above the EPA threshold. So when it was 12 micrograms, you can see in Texas, it was around 40 to 50% of the time we were above the threshold. And you can see that's not true for everywhere else in the country. But now it's come down to 9 micrograms per cubic meter. It's more like over the year 60 to 80% of the time. And this is for Dallas County. So you can actually see it's a lot of the time, and you also have a comparison to the rest of the country. So I think I've trespassed on your time, so I'll just finish with some eye candy. So we also have these robot teams that they're trying to characterize the question, is the area safe? So here they're measuring with the water. This is a dog measuring air quality, actually. So you can imagine this could be doing fence line surveys, the sites, and so on. So, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I did have a brief question earlier with the wearables. There's great diversity in one's autonomic response. In particular, you were wearing one while riding a bike.
Yes.
You can imagine people of varying fitness levels. It's going to be incredibly different.
Yes.
I'm interested in how you standardize those responses to the particular concentration.
So before every ride, the given rider, whoever they were, there was a baseline for the EEG and all of the metrics. So the metrics we used were relative to that baseline. And so what was interesting is when you had multiple riders, as you're rightly saying, there are actually quite a diversity of ages and fitness levels, it ended up all falling. One model could reproduce them all, which we weren't sure that would be the case, but it turned out we could. So that's what gives me some more hope, like whether it's on the one hand a first responder going into a fire, if their wearable is streaming, the captain outside can know how they're doing with a very fine gradation, or if it's a child with asthma or so on. So yes, there is a diversity, but it seems that really we're learning by example. So we sampled the autonomic response of multiple people, and we were comparing that to the reference measurements of the various.
It would just seem that there's an incredible amount of factors involved. For example, that you gave a fireman going into fire, there's both the physical fitness of what he's doing as well as a fear response or maybe lack thereof that would influence all of these things.
So I didn't show you here, but we actually did this for special forces for live fire training, for the actual system that's used to train the president's bodyguards. And so you could actually see them when they were going through these live fire exercises, essentially the thoughts sweeping across their head, like when they were visualizing what they were told in the instructions, making decisions, the motor skills, and you could actually use that for scoring their performance. So I won't pretend to you we know everything, because I know I don't, but there are some robust markers there.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
One quick question. I heard about your ring.
Yes.
I want to know more about it. Where can I buy one?
So this is the leading ring of these. There are several different. This is an Aura ring. They cost about $300. I initially got it because it's a very good sleep tracker, but it can do several other things as well. One charge will last about a week. It links to your phone through Bluetooth. I've been pleased with it. This is actually my third one.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So my next sort of question is for Dr. Afolabi. How does all of this we've seen about environmental factors, how does that affect health?
So I think Dr. Lary spoke about it. These different particles deposit mostly into your lungs to a large part. And if they're small enough, they can go through your lung blood barrier, be absorbed into your blood, and then cause whatever health effects that they can cause in your blood. It seems like these are over more longer periods of time when they're this very small particles in the absorption. And when there's larger particles that stay deposited in your lungs, you can have more acute symptoms, and it does seem that the larger the particle, the more acute your symptoms can be. And of course, you know, asthma is kind of my bread and butter, and so you can definitely have a lot of coughing and wheezing and challenges, and you can have those coughing and wheezing and challenges even when you don't have asthma yourself. And we all know this and see this. We get exposed to heavy amounts of smoke and we cough and we wheeze. Or we don't always wheeze, but we definitely cough. And so asthma is one of those canaries in the coal mine, and that's a patient population that really reacts more robustly and more quickly to those certain triggers, and then it takes longer for them to recover, and they need medicine and intervention for them to recover. We oftentimes are able to, you know, cough for a short period of time, get ourselves out of those. I say we, I have asthma, but people without asthma are able to get themselves out of those situations and recover in a timely manner. But that doesn't. There's not a lot of data on what the long-term consequences of the recurrent exposures are, and so it's unclear if those recurrent exposures cause permanent damage. I would fare to guess that they do, but the data behind it isn't that I've seen isn't conclusive at this point.
So let me, I'm going to feedback on that. I'm going to take off my moderator hat and talk from my advocate hat for a second. So one of the things that's particularly concerned us, and it is a big problem in West Dallas and in South Dallas, particularly in Joppy, is the amount of PM 2.5 that's emitted, largely in this case from factories, which are adding to it. And of course, to Dr. Lary's point, you know, if you think about 35 and 45 is sort of a trap where the air quality is bad because of all of the emissions, you've got multiple effects there. And PM 2.5 has been implicated in asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and again, the evidence by level varies. Preterm birth, birth defects, lung cancer, but within the last 2 months, papers of breast cancer and GI cancer. So you have the small particulate matter
And cardiovascular disease.
and cardiovascular disease, which has multiple negative effects. And if you think about where those plants are located that are doing it, those are located in areas where people have increased vulnerability anyway over time. So, but one of the contributors, now in Commissioner DeRoe's district, we managed to get a TCEQ hearing on a concrete batch plant recently. I went to the Parkland Center for Clinical Innovation has created an asthma vulnerability index based on pulling together a large number of factors. I went out to that index because that information is publicly available. And for the hearing, I presented data on the asthma vulnerability in 75241, which is where that batch plant was located. Second worst asthma vulnerability of any of the 68 zip codes in Dallas County. You know, for the census tract was, I think, 17th out of 300 and some, so it was also in the bottom 3%. There's something clearly going on there which is contributing to at least vulnerability to that. The other thing that struck me is listening to the 20 people from that community who testified at the hearing. We had over 100 people. That's how important it is for this community, who came to that hearing 7 miles away from where they lived. Now, ask the question, why does TCEQ have a hearing 7 miles from the site? Why don't they have it as a church in the community? You know why? Because they don't want to hear. Okay, I'll say that directly. They don't want to hear. Well, they heard. And one of the things that struck me as they testified was that every person who I heard testify, virtually every person, either themselves or some family member, sometimes both, had early onsets of cancer. There's something going on in that community which is toxic for this community, and if we have any humanity, we need to stop it. So that's my point. Yes?
Just a quick question. Where is lead in all of this? Because lead's not going to bring you to the emergency room. It's going to damage the child's brain. So where is lead in this whole thing?
Yeah, and there's no emergency.
I think you have to look at exposure routes. Lead is a fairly heavy chemical, typically sorbed to soil. It is not typically found in aerosols, just because it's a really large molecule. So lead is more of a concern for ingestion or skin contact than breathing. So
And water, yeah.
Water, yeah.
And a lot of our old pipes, which are still lead pipes, and in many places in some of our aging housing, which again tends to be housing of people with modest income, they're still being exposed to lead in pipes.
Very, very interesting. On Carol D, on my way over here, they were talking about the Attorney General is going to try to stop a cement plant being built near Sherman because of all these air.
Fort Worth? Yeah, there's one.
There's one in Fort Worth, but there's another big one in Sherman.
Anyway, yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier about the dust effect from Chad taking 7 days coming overseas. What kind of coordination is there between what goes on here in Dallas and on an international level? Things like what happened with Chernobyl or Fukushima, or the Chinese that have extended coal burning for another 10 years. Are you able to distinguish the influence of those particular foods?
Normally the way you do that is you combine the observations you have from multiple sources. So for example, for the aerosol plumes coming across, there's a satellite which has a LiDAR, so on the satellite it sends out a laser beam that profiles the atmosphere. You can actually see these plumes as they cross the ocean. But what is probably fair to remember is we're in the outflow of Africa, and other countries are in our outflow. So these are things happening on large scales. we each are sharing out pollutants. So it's in all of our interest to try and reduce the local emissions that we can.
NOAA does a lot of work internationally on that type of scale for both air and also in the oceans as well.
So that brings me to the question for the North Central Texas Council of Governments, government in general. What can we do? Let's start with what can, and you talked a little bit about what the governments are doing. What can we do?
So we're in a unique position here in Texas. You will find very active local governments because guess what? When everything hits the fan, it's like they say, all politics is local. They're the ones standing there holding the bag. They're the ones that get the phone calls. They're the ones that get the permit requirements, that sort of thing. So you'll see a lot of action at the local level. You will see a lot of action at the federal level, at least for the time being. The state has is very business friendly. I'll just be tactful.
Yeah.
Yes.
They do not necessarily, we were surprised. The regional climate plan we just did, we were one of 6 areas in the state that were provided funding to do regional climate planning. The TCEQ at the state also got a grant. We knew that, so we were coordinating among the people that had the funding to make sure that we had everybody covered. We knew that TCEQ had to take their plan, whatever it is, to their board, which tends to be fairly conservative and fairly business friendly. They also had to get the governor to sign off on it before they send it back to EPA. We had a betting pool on whether or not they were going to get it submitted. They did get it submitted. And it's interesting because we're looking at things like transportation and air quality and green space and, you know, flooding and things like that. The state plan focused, and it's actually good because it's stuff they can do that the local governments can't. They focused on oil and gas, on the grid, and on industry. So I think in all cases, and so their grant application was like 500 million. I know from what our community said they wanted to do, in both cases, the grant applications were the proverbial drop in the bucket. There is desire, and we had some 50 cities write letters of support for what we're doing. So we're not doing anything crazy. We're not doing anything like Meatless Monday. We're looking at, in fact, we have some very conservative members of our executive board that questioned why we were promoting electric vehicles, because I know that that's a big hoax. So we did an air quality improvement plan, and we largely illustrated how the transportation piece of the pie on those emissions was really a problem child for both critical pollutants like ozone and particulates, and we're in non-attainment for both, and for greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're like, that's it, we're gonna do an air quality improvement plan. Nobody can argue against the need for air quality. Nobody can argue against public health. And so that was our strategy. And realistically, everything that we're doing benefits both. And so I feel like we have a good plan. I think it will help. We're looking at a lot of things. Most people don't know that those really cool TRE trains are diesel. And guess what? They turn them on really early in the morning and run them for a couple of hours. So they're nice and cold for all, or in the summer cool for the commuters, or in the winter warm. Well, all those diesel fumes settle on the adjacent communities that, guess what, are not, it's not Park Cities, it's lower income communities on both the Dallas and Fort Worth sides. So we're looking at things like, well, let's get them cleaner engines. I don't know if it's electric or hydrogen, but we're looking at that. We're looking at one of our transportation planners would come in every morning steamed because he got stuck at a light. And so he's like, I'm gonna fix the signal timing. Well, signal timing is critical. You've got people that back up if it's not timed correctly. And so they came up with some 75 signals that need to be fixed so that traffic moves better. So those are the little things that you probably won't notice unless you're used to being backed up behind a signal. But so there's things like that. EVs can help, but realistically, we need to work with our partners at DART and get a transit system so that we don't have to drive. Because this is the other thing the engineers asked me yesterday. They're like, well, should everybody get EVs? And I'm like, well, you could help, but the gorilla in the room is congestion. And if you have 100,000 vehicles and 50 of them convert over to EVs, you're still going to have congestion, and you're still going to have those pollutants from those cars sitting there. Yes, ma'am.
There's a project done in New York that you might find interesting. It's a lot like what you're talking about. It's called Spatial New York City, and it was a collaboration between MIT and a startup, and I don't remember, but they were proposing how you design the streetscape, like introducing more trees, more walkways, and they could tell you block by block what the particulate matter was in a given neighborhood, and they could rank the neighborhoods by best to worst. So you could see the equity in it too.
That would be really interesting to me. The other thing that New York has going that I aspire to is they have really, really good transit. You can walk a couple blocks, get on the subway, get on the train. Oh, oops, I missed it. Okay, there's another one in 2 minutes. You bit your credit card in the turnstile and you're on. None of this getting an app and trying to figure it out. It's $5 a day, and oh, I've got 3 buses to switch. Oops, I just missed one, so I'm
There's another hour
and a half late.
And I've been waiting so long in the queue
Yeah,
to
so
get on your
I mean,
bus.
I know DART is, they understand this and they're making great strides, but realistically, things like getting people out of their cars, actually all the telecommuting that people did during COVID was really helpful. There's a term for that, it's travel demand management. And so, but it's basically not having everybody on the road at the same time.
So, someone asked a question earlier, I thought it was a really good one. I'd like to hear from each of the panelists. I'd like you to give me one suggestion that each of us can do individually.
Just one.
Well, let's just do 1 or 2. I'll give you one.
This is individually, not as a region. Well, what I personally do is, because I know the emissions from my car. I have a hybrid. I couldn't quite afford the electric vehicle, although I'd like one. I gently pull off from the lights, because if I put my foot right down, that is a very big difference. And so I get better gas mileage and I emit less.
So I was gonna say one easy thing that you can do, because I have a big gas guzzling car, I won't lie, but you can shop, you can be local, you can shop local, right? So you can do those things that you can, instead of going all the way to the Walmart or the Costco, which I love, I'm sorry. You can go to your nearest grocery store or things like that. But not only that, if you have the ability to, you can go to those grocery stores that try to get more local produce, and that stuff isn't being kind of hauled in as much and as far away.
That's a good one. Okay, so when I started doing this climate planning, I have this big thing about walking the talk. So I planted Texas native plants. They do great oxygenation. They have a chance of surviving. I do have an EV, and I do have solar. And after Winter Storm Uri, I have a battery now, and I've used it several times since. So I will be using it if we have a power conservation thing this week. Those are expensive things, but they pay off. My solar is paid off, and it's paid off in savings because I'm able to sell power back to the grid. Plus, I know I'm not gonna freeze my butt off the next time it snows. So, Winter Storm Uri, I literally had ice in my kitchen sink because I hadn't washed my dishes. So it was that cold in my house, and I didn't know when the heat was gonna be that long. So it's like, no, we're not gonna do that. So native plants, trees, that's something anybody can do. Using LED lights instead of although it's really hard to find the old-fashioned kind now, is a really important thing. Simply caulking around your windows and doors is huge. Caulk is not expensive, but that keeps the warm air out and the cool air in, or vice versa. It can help with your electrical bills. Caulk is cheap. And it can be a difference maker. Even using, I have thermal drapes. I have a 1940 style home with a lot of windows, so I have thermal drapes because I need to better insulate my home. So there's a lot of things like that that you can do that will, in the long run, save you money.
I have a question.
I installed solar, I'm the last one. I installed solar last July when it was 115. But over the last, 9.5 months, 78% of my electricity has come from my panels, and correspondingly my bills are lower. The other thing that we do is that Dallas has a pretty good recycling program, except they don't recycle plastic bags and films. So what I do is I collect those weekly. I have a separate bin. I collect those, and when I go to Sprouts or Central Market, which takes those back and recycles them, I recycle my plastic bags. Now, why plastic bags? What does that have to do with the environment? Well, plastic pollution and microplastics in the oceans and so on is a major problem, but plastic production is a major carcinogen. We have areas in Louisiana where the cancer rates are astronomically high because of chemical plants and plastic production. So every time you're using a plastic bag, the way I look at it, you're giving somebody cancer in Louisiana. I don't want to do that.
Louisiana or Houston.
And well, Houston, Louisiana has a cancer alley where Peter grew up is now Cancer Alley.
So
90% of the people that grew up with a dead throat cancer know those cancer.
the thing that's going to happen where cars don't have to be inspected anymore, what's that going to do to us?
They do still have to get inspected.
They still have to.
They do. It's the county thing. I do know that. It's a state thing, but the county has control over if it happens in their county. So in Dallas County, you still would need an inspection.
Because that's where they need the inspection.
Yeah. Reach out to text guy Ames, that's his name. He just got reappointed, and text reach out to him. He'll explain it all to you.
You mean the tax county assessor?
Yeah. Yeah, the Texas County Assessor. Ames, that's his last
I
name.
think part of that is because of our non-attainment status.
Right.
The
counties which are in the non-attainment, they still have to do the pollution inspection, but not the road inspection, not the tire and the windshield.
Right, not the carrot, if it's broken.
That doesn't have to be done, but the pollution part in the counties which are in non-attainment, they still have to do that.
You know, as football's going down, we have to maintain driving as a contact sport.
It's-
Yes, go ahead.
One thing we can all do is talk to our representatives. We're the only state which charges extra for an EV instead of giving a rebate. When you register an EV, you pay extra, $200 or $400 instead of getting a rebate. Well, you get a rebate from the federal, and many of the other states also give a rebate. But here, because of our oil and gas industry lobbying, we have to pay the extra to have an EV registration.
Isn't that the state violating its own law? You're violating Senate Bill 1017, which says you can't disadvantage any type of school. That means that they're violating their own law.
So who's gonna sue?
But I thought part of that was due to the weight
It is.
of those cars that are tearing up the roads and costing us more, so.
It is, they're trying to make up for the revenue that they're
Yeah.
not getting through people. There are gas taxes that pay for roads. And so you've got, with the batteries, a lot of EVs are a lot heavier. And so, they're trying to make up that revenue. I would not mind paying a weight-based, fee for roads. I think that's fair. But we'll see. Because quite frankly, a nice big SUV has the same weight as my little, but that SUV is buying a boatload of gas. And so they're paying a lot of taxes that way. So I mean, but it is weight-based, and that's what roads are designed for, and it's the repeated weight on the road over time is what damages the roads.
Two quick things. One, instead of asthma, is allergy another factor?
Allergy is a big factor, especially with climate change as well. There are, with climate change, we're seeing in infectious disease as well, we're seeing a change in the patterns of pollens and things like that. We're also seeing a change in the pattern of like viruses that are typically seasonal. We're seeing a change in the pattern of like Lyme disease and ticks and stuff like that. That's actually kind of moving further south. So there's actually a lot of climate change health effects that are outside of asthma, but allergies are actually a very big one that is becoming more and more prevalent. Our allergen season is lasting longer. We're having more pollen with those allergen seasons as well. And then we're also having these things called like thunderstorm asthma, but you can have big allergens with that as well. When the changes in barometric pressure along with the superheated air actually causes pollen to burst open and create these huge invisible clouds of pollen that really aggravate your allergies and your asthma.
And the second, I have
Let me sort of follow up on that for just a second, then we'll get to the two of you. One of the areas that got me first interested in asthma and health disparities was work I did when I was working for Parkland, where we looked at disparities in asthma and what was causing them. And what we figured out is that a major cause was, we had 3 zip codes in South Dallas where better than 10% of the Medicaid population on the Parkland health plan had severe or very severe asthma, and that should have been, by the model we were using, about 3%. When we delved into it, it was due to leaks in the walls and poor air conditioning driving the growth of cockroach and mold, which are the 2 predominant allergens in inner city populations. And so that indoor air quality is also a factor. And interestingly enough, the whole question of climate and its effect has gotten the attention of the medical research community to a great degree. There's a lot of stuff now in the Journal of the American Medical Association, a recent excellent article about, editorial about a national model for indoor air quality standards. We need to be adopting those standards really for our public health. But it's very clear, it was very clear from the work that we were able to do that the outcomes in asthma, our outcomes were being largely driven in South Dallas by poor indoor air quality and its effect.
Just a quick thing, we're about to have a city election with a bunch of bond issues. Are there any that have a huge impact on quality that we should watch out for?
So I can speak to that because that was something that I worked on with actually some of the environmental commissioners. One of the city's goals in their climate plan is to be net zero. And originally it just said net zero because we were focused on emissions. As we spoke with the design team for the new convention center, we had several day-long conversations debating net zero carbon, which includes operational carbon and the carbon in your structure, or emissions. And their instruction was go big. They wanted, for marketing reasons, the greenest convention center ever. So as we went forward, we have a goal in that original plan that we wrote in 2020 to be net zero by 2030. So because our grid, and increasingly I'm watching the daily graphs, we're actually more solar and wind now. But because a large proportion of our grid is fueled by fossil fuels, we could be negative on emissions and still not be net zero because our power is coming from a dirty grid, if you will. And so what we did was developed technical specs to guide the implementation of the bond program so that it would be net zero construction moving forward. And that's for both horizontal, like roads and pipes, and vertical construction. So, and it's kind of interesting, we were rooting around to find the history, and we found out that Dallas actually has had a green building code since 2003. So for 20 years, and it's just been kind of like, oh yeah, that's that green stuff. And so we're increasingly moving them to more sustainable design moving forward. One of the things that we have told them we want is LEED, net zero carbon, plus a stretch goal. And one of the things that we brought forward is some of the Fitwell type design, which looks at building health for city facilities. And so I'm really kind of excited about that because we're going to be very quietly building better. And I think that's really pretty critical as we move forward. So with the exception